About 8 years ago, I built this. Then 3 years ago, I started a YouTube channel, and about 10 months after that, I decided to make a video on an updated version. Then probably 18 months ago, I had an idea for another version. So I drew it all out and basically set it aside to work on other projects. Until about 2 months ago, when I built this. This replaced this, which reminded me that I wanted to build this. So let's build this. You know what my videos have been lacking lately? Tall skinny white dudes wearing glasses with baseball hats. Enter Shaun Boyd, from Shaun Boyd Made This. No, but in all sincerity, he really is a great designer, builder, maker of videos, and human being. I'm going to throw a link to one of his videos in the description so you can check him out after this one. He really does build awesome stuff, so I highly urge you to go check it out. Seriously. But we have a lot of work to do, so let's get into it. Up to this point, all we've been doing is breaking down the plywood portions of the build, which is going to consist of a top, bottom, 2 sides, 2 vertical partitions, and 2 shelves. And as you're seeing, we did this with a combination of a table saw and a track saw. And at this point, everything's cut only to rough dimensions, and we'll go over refining everything as we go through each step. And the first of those steps is going to be cutting our 4 outside pieces to size. But before we do that, let's go over a quick refresher on how to make a trapezoidal box. So here, these top angles need to be 75 degrees and the bottom angles need to be 105 degrees. In other words, both are 15 degrees off of 90. To do this, we're going to set our blade to 7.5 degrees away from 45. And that's because 7.5 is half of 15. Now, we can cut all the bevels on all of our pieces that make up the bottom 2 joints, just like any ordinary crosscut on the table saw. For the top joints though, we need to do something different. As you can see here, the angle that we need and the angle of the blade don't match up. And in fact, we can't even tilt our blade far enough to make that cut. So instead, we're going to flip our piece vertical, use a jig, and make the cut that way. Now, in the real world, the order of operation is going to be a little bit different, so let's work through that now. Basically, instead of starting with our horizontal cuts, we're going to start with our vertical cuts. And the reason for this is you have almost no control in determining the length of the piece when you're making your vertical cuts. But with the horizontal cuts, you can set your fence to dial things in just where you want them in the end. Now, the big question that I always get whenever I show this is how do I determine the exact size of my side panels and, more important, the bottom panel? And the real answer is, I don't. Kinda. Really what I do is shoot roughly for whatever size I want when I'm cutting my top and side panels, no math required, just whatever's in the neighborhood of what I had in mind. Then I let all of that determine the size of my bottom panel, again with no math. Instead, I just use some tape to do a quick dry assembly of my top and side panels, make a first cut on my bottom panel, hold it up to my other pieces, mark a line, and then take a few passes on the table saw, just sneaking up on the line until it fits just right. So I'm not shooting for a number, rather just cutting it to fit a gap. Okay, the next thing we want to do is get some thin hardwood strips on the fronts of the pieces that'll eventually become the vertical partitions and the shelves. I already had some thin pieces of walnut laying around, but if you didn't, you're just going to cut an 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick piece that's just slightly wider than your plywood. Then you're going to glue it on, and you can use some tape or some fancy clamps. Once that's had time to dry, you can trim off the excess any number of ways. Personally, I like using my table saw with a jig that holds the surface of the plywood perfectly in line with the blade, so just the overhanging material gets cut free. And I know it's kind of hard to see what's going on in this shot, so here's a quick little drawing that hopefully explains it a little bit more. Okay, now back to the case pieces. Before we glue them up, we're going to need to cut some dados and rabbets into them. Now, conventional wisdom would tell you that you need to cut dados into the top and bottom pieces to accept the vertical partitions. But you'll notice that I'm only cutting them into the bottom pieces, and you're going to see why in just a minute. But in any case, you're going to cut 2 of those and then rabbets along the backs of all 4 pieces. Once that was done, the last thing we wanted to do before calling it a night was get the exterior pieces glued up. And here we're just going to use the tape method. Sometimes I'll use dominoes in these joints to reinforce them, but honestly the biggest benefit to that for me is just that it helps make the glue up go more smoothly when you just have one set of hands. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that here because I broke my smallest domino bit, but fortunately, I've got extra sets of hands. By the next morning, the case was nice and dry and we could start fitting our vertical partitions. So we started by cutting one edge of each piece nice and square. Then we fit that end into the dado, did our best to hold the piece perpendicular to the bottom, and marked a line so that we could make the cuts on the other ends. So at this point the vertical partitions are sized just right, but before we install them, we're going to cut another set of dados into these pieces, which are going to eventually hold the shelves. Now at this point we're going to go ahead and cut those to their finished depths, and we're also going to cut our shelf pieces to their finished depths since they're going to be exactly the same. Okay, now you'll remember we didn't cut dados into the top of the case, and I said we'd come back to that decision, and well, now we're back. So this whole piece is going to get a face frame on it eventually, and that's going to cover up the dados. And really the most important thing is that these vertical pieces be nice and square and parallel to one another. And that's because drawers are going to go in between them. And fitting drawers into a square opening is a lot easier than something that's out of square. And honestly, because this box is a trapezoid, the likelihood of you cutting dados that end up being perfectly placed top and bottom just isn't that high. At least not for me. Maybe you're better than me and you can nail it, but I know that I won't, so I'm saving myself the headache. Instead, I'm just going to install the partitions and use these squares to get them just perfect. And that's going to hold pretty tight. Then to make sure that they don't move, I'm going to cut these little scrap pieces of walnut out and glue them to the underside of the top. And this is something that nobody's ever going to see unless they're really obsessed with this piece and are willing to get down on their hands and knees. Or if they, I don't know, watch this video. Alright, next we're going to set our blade to 15 degrees so that we can start fitting our shelf pieces. So we'll start by cross-cutting one edge of each shelf. And this is going to leave an edge that matches the angle of the cabinet side piece. Next we can put our blade back to 90 degrees, hold that piece up to the cabinet, and mark out a line where we need to cut it so that it fits just right. Then we'll take a few passes, erring on the side of too long, until it fits just right. Now on the angled side, we didn't cut a dado, so we're going to do something similar to what we did on the top. Only here I'm cutting a much beefier, longer strip of hardwood with a 15-degree angle on one side. Then I'm going to install these on the underside of the shelf for extra support. And honestly, you could skip this step if you wanted. Alright, now let's make the face frame. So here I want to use slightly chunkier pieces to give the cabinet a more substantial look, and that will be to sort of match the visual weight of the base. Otherwise, things might start to look out of balance. So here I'm ripping a few pieces of walnut to about 1 1/4 inches wide. Then it's really just a matter of working your way around the perimeter, matching the angles, and cutting your pieces to length. One regret that I have is I should have spent more time milling the walnut to size for this use. The pieces we used had a little bit more curve in them than I would have liked, and we ended up having to nail them in to get them to hold flat. Either way, while gluing them on, I want them to be proud mostly on the inside edge of the cabinet, but with the outside I'm also going to leave them ever so slightly proud, and that's so that we can get a really clean and flush look after they dry by using a flush trim bit on the router. Now let's set the cabinet aside for a bit and start making our base. We started off by making a few templates of our leg shapes, and you could do this with a CNC if you have one. I used my X-Carve, but I've also shown how to do this by hand in another video, so I'm going to link to that below. And actually Shaun has a whole video about this on his channel, so I'm also going to link to that. From there we could cut the pieces free using a table saw, and then roughed out the general shape on the bandsaw. After that, we use some templating bits on the router to mimic the shapes. And you'll notice in these shots that we're leaving some parts, namely the end grain and the parts where the connections will be made. And we'll get to those in a minute on the table saw using a sled. So here we're going to make a quick sled jig for cutting the end grains and the connecting faces. So we start by setting the fence and taking one pass to establish a cut line. And what's important here is that we don't touch the fence again after we've done this. Next, we use the template that we had made to line up exactly where we'd need to cut our connecting face. And I should say, this is a non-crucial cut. You just want to be close and consistent. Then we could put our actual work pieces in and make the cuts to clear away the material. Next, we're going to do the same thing for the face of our short legs. And actually, before we do that, let's look at how the whole base comes together so that you have a better reference point. So it's pretty much just a pair of these two pieces that form a cross. These two will get dominoed together, and these will get dominoed into the existing piece. But before they get connected, we'll also attach these support pieces that the cabinet can rest on top of to support the ends. And I'm not an engineer, but in my head, the thing that this base has going for it is that there's sort of equal but opposite forces being applied. So while weight here would be pushing this down, forcing the joint apart, weight here is also pushing down and forcing the joint together. At least that's how it works in my head. All right, back to the sled. Here we're using the template and making some stops that hold it exactly where the edge is flush with the sled. Finally, we're going to do the same thing to the connecting face on this short piece like we did on the longer piece before the animation sequence. And again here, close and consistent is what's important, not exact.
I think I have it. Maybe just because it's such a tall piece. I was going to say maybe because it's like it just falls down and like leans into the blade and then shoots out.
So at this point we can go ahead and do an initial glue up. And that's going to consist of gluing the two shorter pieces together and all of the little support blocks that go on the connecting faces. And right now we're just very crudely cutting those out, and we're going to attach them as some oversized blocks. And the reason for that's going to become obvious in this next shot, where you see me using the template of the entire leg shape to trace onto the assembly so far. And once that was done, we're going to go through the exact same process again of roughing out the shape on the bandsaw, template routing the bulk of it, and then using a sled to make some final cuts on the end grain. Now right here you're probably thinking that I should have just made this out of one piece because of the seam. But remember that you won't see that because the other two pieces still need to get glued on. And actually the grain direction would look worse and it would be weaker if I tried to make this out of one piece. Alright, let's get back to the cabinet. The next step was to make some drawer boxes, and we decided to class it up with some Blum drawer slides. Blum? Bloom? Rhymes with plum. Blum. I don't know. Anyway, Shaun walked me through how he goes about this, and it's kind of confusing at first, but he has an entire video that covers all this on his channel, so I'm going to link to that one as well. And while he builds the drawer boxes, I'll use this as an opportunity to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. As you guys know, I personally use Squarespace and have been using them for my website for some time now. In fact, Shaun does too. And the reason that he, I, and countless others do is because it makes our lives so much easier. Building your site with Squarespace is insanely easy. You don't need to be a designer to make it look great, and that's because they're the designers. They have tons of modern templates to choose from, all of which employ the latest HTML, CSS, and JavaScript techniques, and every template that they offer is optimized to work with mobile browsers. So no matter how a person navigates to your site, desktop, phone, tablet, it doesn't matter. Your site's gonna look great. Beyond that, they offer 24/7 email support, which is really helpful. I've used it a couple times when I've needed help, and they've always been really quick to get me on the right path. And like I said, the biggest benefit for me is how easy it is to update. In this clip, you've been watching me update my website for an auction page that I'm making to sell this piece that I'm building in the video. It's got an embedded form that people can use to bid, all of the info, a really nice carousel image gallery, and absolutely zero coding was required. And it only took me a couple minutes to put it together. So if you're thinking about starting a website for any purpose, or even if you have an existing website, you owe it to yourself to check them out. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/4eyes and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. Okay, so Shaun's put together our 3 drawer boxes, and now we can start attaching the hardware. And like I said, he has a full tutorial over on his channel that goes into detail. Either way, I don't think that I'm at a point of understanding it well enough to explain it in a video, but I'll wrap my head around it as I use them a few more times. And if you want to understand it better, check out Shaun's video. Here I used the Cat's Moses dovetail jig to make a perpendicular 90-degree cut in the back of my boxes. And I think the hardware goes through this notch, if I recall correctly. These holes I'm drilling here are for support pins that hold the back of the drawer up. Again, I think. In any case, once that's all done, installing the hardware itself is actually really easy. Just a pair of clips on the underside front of the drawer box, and then the slider in the cabinet. And once these things are in, I have to say that they're super smooth and really nice. Top quality stuff. Works like a plum. With the drawer boxes in, I could start making the drawer faces. So here I'm prepping my pieces, and what I usually like to do here is measure my opening, factor in my gaps, and that tells me the size that my drawer faces should be. Then I cut them out just ever so slightly wider than they actually need to be. For the length, I'm going to go ahead and finalize that right now, and I just want to make sure that all 3 are exactly the same. Before we attach them, we need to cut in some handles. So I made myself 2 templates that look like this. One of these will be for the drawer boxes, and the other ones are going to be for the drawer faces. And this way the drawer box won't be seen or felt when you go to pull the drawers open. So using the templates, I roughed out the material using a jigsaw, and then used my router with a flush trim bit to clean it up. At this point, I could start installing. And basically I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. And one of the cool things about these handles is a clamp can fit right in the opening, which makes it really easy to hold them in position while you screw them in. Now, since I cut my drawers slightly wider than they needed to be, I should end up with a last piece that needs to be trimmed just a little tiny bit. So technically it's a smaller drawer face than the other 2, but it's such a little difference that your eye can't see it. But what it does do is allow me to make consistent gaps that go all the way around. And that's something that your eye is a lot more likely to pick up on. Here I'm making the back panel, and I made this out of 4 pieces so that I could leave a gap that ran the length of the piece slightly above and below the shelf line. And this will leave plenty of room for somebody to pull cables through. Somehow I forgot to film myself attaching it, but it's just a couple screws. To attach the base to the legs, I'm going to use some of these figure 8 clips. And I'm not really looking for strength here. Gravity's going to be doing most of the work. I really just need something to keep the base in place. When I built the predecessor to this piece, at the end of the video, I had this little monologue about the idea that form follows function. In it, I argued that it should, but only to a certain extent. In other words, we shouldn't be so rigid that we always favor utility over personality. Tangentially, I get a lot of questions about designing furniture, and oftentimes people will ask me if I use things like the golden rectangle or ratio in my designs. And the truth is, I don't. I mean, I think it's okay for somebody to start there, but I wouldn't ever blindly follow it as gospel. Be it the golden ratio or form strictly following function, If we paid too much attention to those quote-unquote rules, then everything has to be evolving towards one inevitable point. And that, frankly, sounds really boring. So I say take that faith and put it into something more important, like yourself and your ability to make something beautifully inefficient. Special thanks to Levi Wilson, Jake Vance, Taylor Hudson, Tristan Morris, Mark Armstrong, Heath Lacey, Maciek Golecki, apologies for the name butchering, and the rest of my Patreon members for supporting this channel. You all are the engine that keeps this thing going, so thank you, seriously. And if you want to find out how you can support the show too, and snag one of these sweet 4-Eye shirts, click the link in the description, check it out, and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. All right, see you in the next one.